Welcome to Conversations with a Wounded Healer. I'm your host, Sarah Bueno. I'm a psychotherapist, teacher, consultant, and most importantly, a wounded healer, living and working in Chicago, Illinois.
And I'm your host, Remy. I'm a counseling psychotherapist, yoga teacher, and trauma specialist living in Brighton, UK. On this show, we interview folks in a variety of healing professions, and we discuss the intersectional journey of healing self while caring for others.
But we're not just focused on individual healing, but also healing on the collective level, from white supremacy, late-stage capitalism, and the patriarchy. Thanks for joining us.
Let's try that again. Hey, Sarah.
Hey, Anne.
How you doing?
I am curious how people are going to respond to your news.
Yeah.
We have news.
I have news, friends. Today is my last episode of the podcast, which I feel all kinds of feelings to say, actually. I'm noticing I'm feeling really sad to actually say it, but it's a decision that I've made kind of based on knowing that I need to take better care of myself, which for an overachiever like me means I need to do less. And it's a really hard decision to make and a very difficult lesson to learn. But that's what my body is telling me needs to happen right now, that after a 5-year master's course and trying to do so many things at the same time, that I need to do one thing at a time, which unfortunately means, that today will be my last episode.
I don't understand it. and I'm not being a dick. I'm not being a dick. But no. It's so funny, like, because when I've told people that this was coming, I'm like, what do you mean your life has not worked? Like, I don't understand that. And I think that's okay for you. And this is okay for me because, this is what brings me the most joy. And not just the podcast, all the things that I do. And everything I do outside of work is just sit on the couch and watch TV. And I'm great with that. Yeah. So I just like fundamentally don't understand it, but I trust it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think for me, I don't want my life to just be work, which is also fine, I think, this doesn't feel like work. It's never really felt like work. So I don't necessarily put it under that category, but it does take up time. And I know that that time at this moment in my life needs to be spent taking better care of myself, especially as I plan to do a lot of big things and have some big projects coming up, which I'm really excited about. But in order to be able to do those in a sustainable way, it sucks. And I'm really sad. And I'm really grateful to everybody who welcomed me onto your podcast, including you. I'm grateful that you asked me to join in the first place. I'm grateful to all of the nice feedback that we've gotten as co-hosts, to the editors and everyone who helps work on the podcast.
And Andrea specifically.
Specifically Andrea, yeah. And I have loved doing this. I have gotten to speak to some incredible people that I would not have spoken to otherwise. I've learned a lot about myself. We, as a duo, have had some discussions that have pushed me and challenged me as a person, as a therapist. And I've learned a lot from you. So I'm really grateful to this experience and to you, for just letting me be a part of it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I get feedback in different arenas about like, oh, how hard it must be to sell your business, how hard it must be to share your podcast. And like, that's just not, I don't know, that's just never how I have thought about, like, yes, it's mine, but I'm sharing this with listeners. I'm sharing this with you. I want to be changed by the conversations that I have, and so I don't know. It felt like there was time for a shift, and you were there to, do like, you are such a fucking natural. So if you don't podcast again, you are robbing the world of something fun.
I have ideas in the back of my head for one that I would do in the future.
Yeah. And that was part of this experiment too, is that you were like, I want to grow my brand. I want to learn about this. And I was like, and I just want to do something a little bit different. And so we did the experiment. It worked and it's over, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there are going to be a couple more changes to the podcast, but don't worry, you guys, I'm not going anywhere yet. I mean, eventually, obviously, probably this will end, but not in 2025, it won't. Yeah, and we're going to have our 7-year anniversary coming up in March. So,
And I will celebrate that from afar, but like not from afar, because how far is the internet? But, and this is the thing, like it has always felt exactly the way that you just said, that this was something you were sharing, not something that you were controlling. You've always been great to work with. And so this is always like, it's an enterprise that I will always cheer on. I hope that all of you support the podcast so that Sarah can continue doing it. I would love for this. Yeah. I would love for this. Yeah, I would love for it to grow and do great things. And I hope it continues to like support and inspire people, because it already does. And that's it. Yeah. I just want everything to succeed and be wonderful.
Yeah. And I did want to make explicit for listeners, if anybody was hearing tension between you and I, that was something that you and I talked about off air after we recorded our last intros. And, you know, I got to share like, I'm feeling like you're leaving me and like I've upset you and you think I'm crazy and like all of these things. And I mean, I can let you say what your response is to that.
I mean, my response to that was, yeah, that's not how I'm feeling. There's nothing personal. There never was anything personal, but I understand why that was coming up for you. I understand why you would feel like that. And I think one of the things that I had told you is that like right now in my kind of self-development, I'm in a bit of an avoidance era, which is something that I'm working on and is also kind of okay for me right now, because historically hasn't been my way of operating. And so it's nice in some ways to kind of like not be in my anxious era, but to be in a more avoidant era, because unfortunately the way that I work is I have to swing from one side to the other before I land in the middle. So to me, what that means is at the moment it's probably not super great for the way that I'm communicating with people, and I can appreciate and understand that. And I'm fully sure you were picking up on some of that because you're very intuitive and understanding. And what it means for me is that I will eventually level out, and I know that. But it also means that, that I might not be giving off the normal signals, shall we say.
Yeah. Well, and I think this whole experiment, what I really would like listeners to take away from the way that we've related to each other on the podcast is that we can have hard conversations.
Yeah.
And we can disagree. And we can see things very differently and still really love and care for one another. And I know that there's a lot of people saying, but this, but that. Like, sure, yeah, there are different nuances to it, but you know, the divide that seems to be happening between therapists right now, I don't think it's quite as wide as it needs to be. And I think that the conversations that we've had are evidence that that can be traversed skillfully when two people are willing to show up in that way.
And I think that's something that you and I have navigated pretty well, is having those discussions and kind of saying the things that we both feel like need to be said. And yeah, I'm very grateful to the whole experiment, the times. Yeah, I'm feeling nothing but gratitude. You and I have always been good at having those discussions, and I'm just really grateful to you, to the experience, to the experiment, to all of it.
Yep.
And to everyone who's listened and been a part of it. And maybe it's not the end. Who knows?
You never know.
You never know.
Right? With you and I twisting and turning, who knows what's going to happen.
That's right. That's correct.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being up for the adventure.
It's been a great adventure.
Yeah.
I got to talk to one of my favorite drag artists.
And that will probably always be my favorite interview on the podcast. That makes me jealous that I was not a part of it.
And just to bring it to today's guest, I did get to talk to like the queen of trauma theory and feminist trauma theory, which was actually a super exciting big deal for me. So it felt really nice that my interview today with Judith Herman is my last interview. And it really felt like, oh yeah, like wouldn't have gotten to speak to her otherwise.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah, it's the stuff dreams are made out of.
That's right. Yeah.
I was going to ask you if you wanted to say anything about this interview or if you wanted to say anything else in general.
I always appreciate so much hearing older people who are liberal.
Yes.
Because where I grew up, that is, I mean, I will never forget my dad saying, like, you know, you're liberal when you're young and when you're old, you become conservative. And that's just how it happens.
They sure did tell us that.
They really did. Maybe that's an Ohio thing. I don't know. But when I met my mother-in-law, who now she's 86, she's very liberal. And so I really love hearing her take on politics because of all of her experience. And so I really loved the way that Judith was talking about, you know, how the field has moved and grown and what she sees as exciting about the future. I hope that I think we're in a bit of a time right now where people are not necessarily excited to hear from their elders. Unfortunately, like that's kind of what I'm getting in a lot of spaces. And so I'm going to keep being excited about listening to our elders. And I hope that, you know, as a collective, we sort of come back to that space to appreciate the wisdom of the people who've, like you really get into is like, I am here because you did what you did. And that is such a profound gift that our elders have given us. And I hope, I just hope we can lean into that.
As long as they're wise elders and not just like people who are older than you. I think there's a difference between...
Well, we need discernment.
Yes, I think there's a difference between an elder and a person who is older than you. I'm not trying to listen to some people who are older than me and their opinions that are not helpful. But yeah, it was such a gift to be able to talk to Judith, and she was very kind. And yeah, I'm excited for everyone to hear this and just to get a full sense of what her career and her life has been like. And I hope all of that for you and for and I hope that in whatever, 30, 40 years, we are having a conversation on someone else's podcast or media outlet that we don't even know exists yet. I hope we're having these same conversations with the new generation of therapists in 30 or 40 years. So yeah, on that note, for the very last time, let me introduce my guest. Judith Lewis Herman, MD, is a senior lecturer in psychiatry part-time at Harvard Medical School. For 30 years, until she retired, she was director of training at the Victims of Violence program at the Cambridge Hospital in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She is the author of award-winning books Father-Daughter Incest, Trauma and Recovery, and she is the recipient of numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1984 and the 1996 Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. Like, that's life goals. In 2007, she was named a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. Her new book, Truth and Repair: How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice, was published in March 2023. And with that, please enjoy this episode with Judith Herman.
Are you feeling the seismic shifts currently reshaping the therapy field? From AI to rising healthcare costs, our field is at a crossroads. But what if these disruptions weren't just challenges, but opportunities for transformation? I'm excited to introduce Redefining the Future of Psychotherapy, a groundbreaking 12-week program where I've partnered with organizational consultant Mark Matisse to help therapists navigate and thrive in these challenging times. Together, we'll explore how cultural values and systemic forces are impacting mental health care. You'll learn to apply powerful frameworks like spiral dynamics to enhance your practice, transform challenges into opportunities, and develop practical strategies for both you and your clients. Starting February 13th, 2025, we'll meet virtually every Thursday for live interactive sessions. You'll earn a Level 1 certification in spiral dynamics, and up to 24 CEUs are available. This isn't just about surviving these tumultuous times. It's about working together to create positive change. Register now at tinyurl.com/futureoftherapy and join us in redefining the future of psychotherapy. That's tinyurl.com/futureoftherapy.
Judith Herman, welcome to Conversations with a Wounded Healer.
Thank you for having me.
I'm guessing some of our listeners will already know who you are, but would you mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about what you do?
I'm a psychiatrist. I'm a retired professor. My official title is Senior Lecturer in Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. And my specialty is psychological trauma. I've written 3 books. The first one was called Father-Daughter Incest, that came out in 1981. The second one was called Trauma and Recovery, and that came out in 1992. And then most recently, in 2023, I published a book called Truth and Repair, How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice.
So I came to your work through the book Trauma and Recovery, and I had already read Gabor Mate, Bessel van der Kolk, and I remember as I was reading them going like, where are the women? And then I found your book and I was like, oh my God, here they are. And I think even within the first 5 pages of that book, I learned more about the history of the profession. And I think one of the things that really, really struck me was like, I got to hear about women's role in the history of it and how kind of really shit it was for women. But also knowing you were out there existing and still working really made me feel better. Like it was that sort of visibility of, oh, this is what I can aspire towards. Do you know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I had the good fortune to come of age in the second wave of women's liberation movement, which kind of set the direction of my whole career. I mean, when I was in med school, women were 10% of my class. And of course, on the first day when we walked into the dissecting room and met our cadavers, I had to let down the side by fainting. And, just in case anybody might possibly question whether we had the stones for medical school. No. So we were a token presence in the profession at that time. But I was class of 1968. But 10, 15 years later, because of the women's movement, professions were being integrated. And I developed the theory that when women reach maybe 15 to 20% of profession or a business or where they have been marginalized, that's kind of when you go from being a token to actually being able to organize and have a voice. And when I was on the Committee on Women of the American Psychiatric Association in the 1980s, and we were about 15, 20% by that time. And we made some noise. And we were starting to be able to, have a voice in the profession. And we called attention to all the blind spots in the profession about violence against women and its impact. And I think in some ways that's the only way you really make progress in learning about trauma, because we were talking about things that nobody wanted to talk about. And in some ways it was the Vietnam Veterans Against the War who are responsible for getting post-traumatic stress disorder recognized in the diagnostic manual, because they came back and testified that no, we're home safely from Vietnam, but in our minds we're still in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And similarly, it was the women who, when they organized speak outs on rape and domestic violence and sex trafficking, that actually brought to public attention the fact that the most common traumas are not those of men in war, but of women in so-called private life.
What did it feel like when you went from that space that you kind of talked about, where you go from being completely marginalized to having a voice?
Oh, well, I mean, that was all I mean, it was a feeling of liberation. And it was the fact that I was in a consciousness raising group in 1970 when I started my psychiatric residency that enabled me to hear my patients in a whole different way. My first two patients on the inpatient service when I began my residency in July of 1970 were women who had been hospitalized after making very serious suicide attempts. And both of them gave me histories of father-daughter incest. Now, you want to guess what the comprehensive textbook of psychiatry said at that time about the prevalence of incest?
Well, I remember reading something about this in your book and being very concerned, but I don't remember the exact statistics.
Well,
So I'm going to let you tell
can't
us.
make this stuff up. One case per million.
Oh,
So what do you think were the odds that a complete, newbie would get 2 cases in a month?
yeah. It's one of these, I think I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, one of the things I remember reading in Trauma and Recovery was that they had actually kind of posed this alternative theory to Freud's theory when he was still learning or presenting or something that was like, actually, these women have all been sexually abused. And they said, the counselor, whoever they were presenting to, said, oh, men don't do that enough for all of these women to be telling the truth. So we're going to go with this guy's idea of penis envy.
Well, no, Freud himself actually first published one of his very first papers in 1896 was called The Etiology of Hysteria. And he had a bunch of cases, all of which had stemmed from child sexual abuse. And when he published the paper, he thought this was going to make him famous. And instead it got him ostracized because nobody wanted to believe it. And so he did a 180 and said, oh, no, actually, the women made it up because that's what they really desired and fantasized about. When he reversed himself, it wasn't based on any new evidence for patients. It was just based on the idea that, these were respectable bourgeois families of Vienna, and how could that be possible?
And that's what I remember reading and going, think about how many people could have been helped if we would have listened the first time.
Well, interestingly, his colleague Genet in France never did. He independently came up with the same formulation, but nobody paid attention to him because they didn't want to believe it. And the only way for women to participate in scientific research at that point was as subjects.
Yeah.
There were no women investigators. So that's the difference.
So what has it been like to watch the industry grow and change and maybe not change over your career?
Well, there's been a lot of progress, and there's also been a lot of backlash, and there's still a long ways to go. So, I think the general level of public awareness is certainly much greater than it was. And the level of scientific research is way better than it was 50 years ago. Or, there's been some remarkable research in terms of, so we have a much better idea about epidemiology and the psychological and physical impact of psychological trauma, and, some progress in treatment. I think in terms of the kind of social responses to gender violence, it's definitely a work in progress.
To say the least, I think.
Well, one of the things I read way back in the 70s was a wonderful pamphlet by Juliet Mitchell, who's a British psychologist. She wrote a wonderful little paper called Women, the Longest Revolution. And she argued that, say, compared to liberating the working class, liberating women was going to be way more complicated because the working class were oppressed in one domain, and that was production. But women are oppressed in 4 domains: production, reproduction, sex, and childbearing, family and childcare. And basically, you need to make progress in all 4. And you can make progress in one domain, but have a setback in the other domain. And so that's why it's the longest revolution. So I have found that comforting over the years, because I think you do have to take the long view. I mean, the United Nations now finds that violence against women is the most prevalent and long-standing human rights violation in the world. So that's what we're up against.
I think when you put it like that, part of me wants to feel disheartened, but I think the majority of me goes, like, allows me to sort of see the wins where we can get them, especially politically right now, where it feels like we've taken such a big step back. It feels really important to be able to look at it in that kind of nuanced way.
Well, and to realize this is a long fight, So, I mean, I'm thinking of a statement that I think Tarana Burke made from Me Too in the U.S. when the Supreme Court, revoked the right to an abortion. She said, basically, we keep going. This is not progress isn't linear, and this is a long fight, and we're just going to keep on organizing. So.
Yeah. I'm thinking about what we were talking about before we started recording about self-defense classes.
Oh, yeah.
And teaching women to yell. And what I had said to you was the hardest thing for me to learn was actually to give a punch. I had no problem taking a punch. And I think something that I'm incredibly grateful for is the women in the 1960s and 1970s did a lot of that learning to fight so that I can come along. I was born in 1987. I can come along, and the idea of being allowed to fight already exists for me. And so I'm incredibly grateful to you and to everybody else who kind of laid that foundation for us, so that I'm kind of looking at you, retired, having spent your entire career fighting for this, going like, okay, I'm probably in for the same.
Yeah. Well, but here's an example of what I found hopeful. When my daughter was 13, knowing what I know about violence against women, I wanted her to take a self-defense class. And one of my colleagues, a dear friend and colleague, Emily Schatzo, had her first daughter 6 weeks before my daughter Emma was born. And they'd been friends since they were babies. They still are. And I said, you and Rachel can take the class together and, you'll be buddies. She said, well, what about you, Ma? I said, moi? In my Miss Piggy voice. She said, yeah, you. So that was the deal. Emily and I took the class with Rachel and Emma. And you should have seen the difference between our fights and our daughter's fights. When we got up on, model mugging, I don't know if that's the kind of class you took. It's co-taught by a male and female instructor. And the male instructor has a huge helmet and body armor on. And it's not a polite, bow to your opponent, self-defense. It's how to fight dirty when you're pinned to the ground. And the guy is saying, spread 'em, bitch. So the woman instructor coaches you. The male instructor is the mugger. And you have to fight until they judge that you would have delivered a knockout blow if the mugger had been wearing all this body armor.
Yeah.
So Emily and I would get up on the mat for our fights, and we would be sort of it's a slumped posture, the bowed head, we would be kind of cringing and with an expression on our faces that went, why am I here? Am I really doing this? I can't believe I'm. But we did it. We had our fights,
Mm-hmm.
And, they taught you how to aim for the eyes, the nose, the jaw, the groin, how to deliver a knockout punch.
Mm.
When our daughters got up on the mat, it was kind of like, bring it on, And the mother approaches Rachel. She says, get out of my space.
Oh, all right.
So I thought that was a hopeful sign.
I think it's so important when we're doing this work to find the things that are hopeful and jovial, because I think it can kind of drag us down if we let it.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's the size of, but that's true of any form of oppression that's deep embedded in the culture, where the dominance of one group over another is basically, it's a matter of law, it's a matter of custom, it's like a law of nature. And the violence that's used to maintain that dominance is either invisible.
Yeah.
Or it's rationalized and excused, and that's basically a crime of impunity. So yeah, that's where we're starting from. And, that's true whether the oppression is based on gender or caste or class or race, you name it, religion.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what gets you excited for the industry, the future of how our profession changes. What gets you excited?
Well, I guess it's young people like you, I still do some supervision. I supervise psychiatry residents and psychology postdocs. And, they're just so dedicated and bright and imaginative, and, they're going to be wonderful clinicians. So, there's always that new generation coming up. They're going to have their work cut out for them, unfortunately, because the state, not just state of trauma care, but mental health care. I have a colleague, Frank Putnam, who's an amazing researcher, clinician, and policy guy. Was PI for many years of a 30-year prospective longitudinal study of sexually abused girls where the abuse had been confirmed by Child Protective Services. He's followed those kids who are now adults and matched with a matched control group. The study's still ongoing. They're looking at the next generation. He documented, the development of dissociative and borderline personality disorders, but not only the psychological harms, but the medical, all the endocrine abnormalities, the premature aging, early puberty, obesity, all kinds of medical, and then social problems, early pregnancy, dropping out of school, all that kind of, and of course, involvement with the mental health system.
Yeah.
So, he's been a major contributor to our understanding of the impact of childhood abuse. And he also organized early intervention programs. And he's really done it all. He and I do a blog for Psychology Today now called What is Happening to Mental Health Care. But between him and me, we call it WTF. It's kind of a late stage capitalism comes to healthcare.
Yeah.
And mental health is always, the canary in the coal mine because nobody wants to pay for it.
Yeah.
In the US, we're in a situation where our people with major mental illness who used to be housed at least in hospitals, are now either housed in prison or on the street. The prisons in the US are the largest caregivers for people with severe and persistent mental illness.
Yeah.
So that's where the younger generation is. That's what they're inheriting. But they're wonderful, you know. They went into the profession because they want to help people. And they really do.
Do you think that's different from the people who got into it when you were starting?
No, but along the way, you know, I think life takes over, and between the raising a family and doing your job and so on, dealing with the larger social issues kind of falls by the wayside. And that's why I think it's so important for people somehow to stay engaged in some sort of social action, because that's what makes the difference.
Yeah, I've said it on this podcast before, but I always look forward to the day that what I say is outdated, because it means that I need to update myself. And it means that we as a people have opened out something else to people who didn't have something before.
Well, for example, organizing a podcast is, you know, the kind of thing that I wish more professionals would get involved in public education, because we can't reform the system by ourselves.
Yeah.
We don't have the clout. It's not until the public gets outraged and demands something that you see a change. So, for example, now in the United States, there's a lot of publicity and uproar about the degree to which third party, you know, we're the only developed country that doesn't have universal health insurance. We have, you know, stage 4 capitalism, and healthcare is a product. And just recently, there's been a lot of public outrage about how health insurance companies take your money, and then when you get sick, they deny your coverage.
Yeah.
And you're stuck with thousands of dollars of medical bills. Or you're dead because they refuse to authorize life-saving procedures. And it's going to be that kind of public outrage that results in any kind of reform.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think it's interesting because in the UK right now, they do have social health care, but it is increasingly more private.
Yeah. Well, and it's apparently hugely underfunded, right?
So the reason that it's becoming more private is because the rich people here saw how much money there is to be made on healthcare in the United States and went, we'll have a bit of that. And so unfortunately, the social healthcare system here gets used as a political ping pong ball.
Right? I mean,
yeah.
And where the poor people have to get public sector healthcare, and rich people pay for private.
Exactly. And it's like watching a car crash, except the driver could have stopped it because they've seen all the evidence on the other side of the ocean. And they're doing something similar with their student loan system here. Like, it's moving more and more towards the United States. And it's interesting because I did my therapy training in the UK, and I was expecting to find a group of like very vocal, like social, like fuck the system kind of people. And I did not find that. And that was not my school was not like that. Some of my classmates were like that. But on the whole, it was me and one or two other people making noise about like, why aren't you teaching us about working cross-culturally? Why aren't, why are we not talking about a lot of these issues? Why did we get like one day on diversity? And I think you're right that if the general public knew a lot more about what could be possible if things were different. Yeah, because a group of therapists talking to each other is not going to change everything, but getting everybody involved. Yeah. What I'm really curious. So something that I've really been trying to do recently when I get to speak to people who have gone through an extensive career, I'm always really curious about what kind of wisdom you'd like to pass on to
Ah,
those of us who are earlier in our careers, and also what you kind of want to charge us with.
well, I think that just falls on what we've been talking about.
Mm,
My mother was the daughter of immigrants who got herself an education and became a psychologist,
mm,
and was also always politically engaged.
mhm,
And one of her pearls was pick your battles, but the other one was activism is the antidote to despair.
mhm,
I thought that has held up over my lifetime, because when you get involved in trying to make the world a better place, you see the best of, you become part of a group of like-minded people who are also altruistic. They want to do something to make things better. And, you see, you're in the company of wonderful people. And that's always very inspiring. If you're isolated, you feel helpless and
yeah.
you're going to burn out or, give up. So that's what I would pass along.
I like that because it feels simple. I know it's not simple because like staying active, and it takes a lot of energy.
It takes energy, and you also don't want to burn out. You also have to pace yourself. You have to, you have to be able to take a break. You have to be able to play and have fun. And, you can't be deadly serious trying to repair the world every minute, I mean, at the Victims of Violence program, I think one thing that kept our morale up was we had good parties, and we went to the beach, and we liked to sing, and we put on plays, and we rode in the dragon boat races on the Charles River for Cambridge Hospital.
Cool.
So we painted our faces. I mean, we had fun. So yeah, you got to be able to just chill from time to time. But
that's an important lesson too. It's something. One of the things that I tell my clients all the time is we can't just talk about the painful stuff. We have to talk about what brings you joy. We have to talk about. We have to celebrate the sort of moments that come, because otherwise, what are we doing this for?
Well, and also you have to build on those areas of strength.
Yeah.
Is there something that you enjoy? And if so, let's build on that. And, if you don't trust any human beings, do you like animals?
Mm.
Do you, because if you can feel love and kindness toward a pet, that means your capacity for love has not been destroyed, and you're going to survive,
I think as you're talking about this, what I always come back to as a therapist, especially dealing with really heavy shit, is, and yet here you are.
Yep. Yep.
It's the triumph of the human spirit.
You could say that. Yes.
I think and I hear that, and that kind of like, okay, if not people, then pets. If not pets, then books. Everybody will have a thing.
Yeah.
That's part of our work, is to help them find that thing if they can't find it.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, after a career spanning many decades, how do you feel about the term healer as applied to yourself and what you're doing?
Well, I think I prefer terms like ally, consultant, witness, because I think my only objection to it is it gives a little too much agency to me. Whereas I think, especially with trauma patients who have been disempowered, you really want to promote the idea that they are in charge of their own recovery.
Yeah.
And you are there to help.
Yeah.
So I would say helper rather than healer, but that's a minor quibble.
Yeah. What about the term wounded healer?
Well,
or wounded helper?
Well, most of us have some sort of wound. So why not? Interestingly, it became quite popular among the Vietnam vets against the war because they didn't want to go for help to the the medical system. They formed these RAP groups, which were basically like consciousness raising groups, where they could both give to one another and receive help, and kind of become role models for the fact that despite your wounds, you could not only heal yourself, but also give to others. And I thought that was a beautiful image.
It is a really beautiful image. And it's interesting. It's interesting to think about. One of the things that feels really important to me is legacy, not my own, but the sort of legacy of our work and understanding the history of it and how we got where we are, because I think that can provide us the best map of where to go to next. And I think as you're kind of talking about that, I can hear how we got where we are. I can hear why I do the things that I do because of that.
Right. And, just as I sort of feel like I could see myself in a generational line going to my mother and my grandfather and, so on.
Exactly that. Yeah. And it feels, I think that sense of connectedness, I don't know, it just feels nice. Yeah.
Yeah. It gives you some perspective. It allows you to take the long view. My late husband, Alan Grobard, was basically a very optimistic person. And he wrote in his 25th college reunion report, he wrote that certain recent political developments had given him hope. And he named the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and the abolition of slavery.
I feel really privileged to be able to have this conversation with you because your work has so deeply influenced mine, and to be able to hopefully carry on the work that you've done in your career into what I do in my future. And
that's very gratifying for me. So thank you.
Well, mutual admiration, mutual appreciation here. And it does feel like one of my mentors in the UK, Dr. Aisha Mackenzie Mabenga, who her specialty is writing on how to work cross-culturally and how to work in an anti-racist manner. She's recently retired, although I suspect she's retired in the way that you're retired, where you're still pretty active. And I feel very privileged to have been able to learn and to be able to speak to people who have done a lot of what I feel like is the heavy lifting so that I can do the heavy lifting for the next generation. And hopefully at some point in time, we all achieve a much more liberated state.
Yeah, we'll pay it forward.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation with me.
Thank you for having me.
Where can people find your work?
The first book is from Harvard University Press. The second and third are from Basic Books in New York. They're easy enough to find in a bookstore or online.
You're very Googleable. So it's easy to find all of your work. And I just want to say again how much I appreciate all of the work that you've put in your career. And cheers to whatever comes next. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks to our guest for an amazing conversation today. To find out more about today's guest, you can visit www.headheartbiztherapy.com/podcast.
You can find Sarah at Head Heart Biz Therapy on Facebook and Instagram.
And you can find Anne at Spare Room Wellness or spareroomwellness.com.
Thanks as always to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for editing, to Liam O'Donnell for the album art, and to Ben Mueller for our theme music. Until next time, bye-bye.